Chicago had learned to recognize silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that followed Rafael DeLuca. When he entered Velvet Room, the music didn't stop. It lowered. Laughter thinned out. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Rafael didn't scan the room. He didn't need to. He moved like someone who had already decided how the night would end. Black suit, no tie, controlled, cold. He slid into the raised corner booth reserved permanently in his name. "Whiskey," he said, without looking up. 21. Neat. An attendant approached with steady steps, not one of the glittering hostesses who hovered near politicians. She wore fitted black slacks, sleeves rolled neatly at her wrists. No forced smile, no perfume cloud. Her name tag read, Elena Morales. She placed the glass in front of him. Then she didn't leave. "You've had 3 already," she said evenly. The booth stilled. Rafael lifted his eyes slowly. "Are you counting for me?" he asked. "I'm keeping the room from counting for you." One of his lieutenants shifted uncomfortably. No one corrected Rafael DeLuca in public. Rafael leaned back against the leather seat. "You work for tips," he said calmly, "not advice." "And you run Chicago," she replied. "Not me." A nearby table went silent. Rafael reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded stack of cash, thick, deliberate. He dropped it on the table between them. "Then let's make this simple," he said. "Take it. Bring the bottle. Smile." Elena looked at the money. Then she picked it up. The room leaned in. Instead of pocketing it, she pressed it back into his palm. "I don't take money to pretend," she said. The tension snapped tight. Rafael stood. Slowly. Every eye in the club shifted toward them. "Do you understand who you're talking to?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "And you're still talking." She stepped closer. Close enough that the table couldn't hear. "Raise your voice at me again," she said softly, "and I'll embarrass you in front of everyone you're trying to impress." His men stiffened. A councilman near the bar looked down at his drink. This was the moment. The one where Rafael DeLuca reminded the city why they feared him. Instead, he held her gaze. Then he sat back down. "Leave the bottle," he said evenly. She did, and walked away without turning back. Rafael watched her disappear into the crowd, for the first time in a very long time. Someone had refused him, and worse, she hadn't flinched. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe for more stories. Rafael DeLuca did not replay conversations. He replayed leverage. Yet 3 nights after Velvet Room, he found himself remembering the exact tone of her voice. Not loud, not emotional, just certain. "I don't take money to pretend." It irritated him, not because she refused, but because she hadn't hesitated. Most people who defied him did it trembling. She had done it calmly. That was new. He sat in his office overlooking the Chicago River, the skyline reflected in the glass behind him. Midnight, city lights blinking like restless thoughts. "Find her," he said without turning. Marco, his head of security, nodded once. "Full file?" "Everything." By morning, a folder sat on Rafael's desk. Elena Morales, 27. No criminal history, no political connections, no hidden debts. Rafael flipped the pages. On day shift, registered nurse at Northwestern Memorial. Night shift, Velvet Room attendant. Apartment in Pilsen, modest lease. No luxury purchases, no suspicious transfers. Clean, too clean. "She's not connected to anyone?" Rafael asked. "No rivals, no feds, no gangs," Marco replied. "Works 2 jobs, pays her bills, that's it." Rafael closed the file. "She didn't flinch," he said quietly. Marco didn't answer. He knew that tone. It wasn't anger, it was assessment. 2 nights later, Rafael returned to Velvet Room. Not for business, not for a meeting, just to see. The music shifted again when he entered. Heads turned, conversations paused. She was behind the bar tonight, hair tied back, sleeves rolled. Calm. She saw him. There was no flicker of surprise, no apology, no tension. She simply finished pouring a drink and handed it to a customer before walking toward his booth. Professional. Neutral. "What will it be?" she asked. No edge, no smile, just steady. "You tell me," Rafael replied. She didn't blink. Water would be wise. One of his men almost laughed, then thought better of it. Rafael studied her carefully. "You're bold when you think I'm tired," he said. "You weren't tired that night," she replied. "You were showing off." His jaw tightened slightly. "And you enjoy correcting powerful men?" "I enjoy not being disrespected." The exchange was quiet but electric. No raised voices, no theatrics, just two people testing boundaries. He leaned back. "Do you know how many people would trade places with you right now?" he asked. "I'm not interested in their lives. You could work somewhere better." "I do," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "The hospital." She held his gaze. "Ah," he said softly. "So you know I looked." "I assumed you would." "And that doesn't concern you?" "Should it?" There it was again. Not fear. Not defiance. Indifference to power. Rafael wasn't used to indifference. Threats he understood. Loyalty he commanded. Fear he expected. But indifference? That stripped status down to its bones. "You work 2 jobs," he said. "That's exhausting." "So is ruling half the city." He almost smiled. Almost. "You think this is about ego," he said. "You dropped cash on a table," she replied. "It usually is." He stood. Slow. Controlled. The club watched again. He stepped closer. Not threatening, just present. "You think I need people to impress?" "No," she said evenly. "I think you need them to react." Silence stretched between them. The room waited for something explosive. Instead, Rafael reached for his wallet again, pulled out a black card, set it on the table. "No tip," he said. "No bribe. Just an invitation. Dinner. Somewhere quiet." Elena looked at the card, then pushed it back toward him with one finger. "I don't date customers." "You don't know if that's what this is." "I do." A pause. "You're not impressed," he said. "No. Not even a little." She shook her head once. "You're powerful," she admitted. "But power is loud. I prefer competence." The word settled heavier than an insult. Competence. She had just placed him in a category and found it insufficient. Rafael picked up his card, slipped it back into his wallet. For a moment, something unfamiliar flickered across his face. Not humiliation, not anger. Interest. "You're very confident for someone who works nights serving men like me," he said. "I serve drinks," she replied calmly. "Not men." That landed clean. He held her gaze for a long beat, then nodded once. "Bring the water," he said. She did. No victory smile, no triumph, just professionalism. As she walked away, Rafael watched her again. Not with possession, not with lust, with calculation. This wasn't attraction. It wasn't infatuation. It was disruption. She had walked into his world and refused to bend, and that unsettled him more than any enemy with a gun ever had. For the first time in years, Rafael DeLuca had met someone who did not care what he owned, and he couldn't decide if that irritated him or intrigued him. Rafael DeLuca did not panic. He anticipated, he calculated, he controlled, until the sound came from down the hall. It was small at first, a sharp inhale, then another, then a strangled gasp that didn't sound like breathing at all. Rafael was out of his office before the third one. Mateo's bedroom door was already open. His 6-year-old son was sitting upright in bed, hands clawing at the air near his chest. His small body was shaking, his eyes wide, not crying, not screaming, just confused. "Papa," Mateo tried to say, but it came out thin and broken. Rafael crossed the room in 2 steps. "Inhaler," Mateo whispered. Rafael grabbed it from the nightstand, pressed it to his son's mouth. 1 dose. 2. "Slow," Rafael said, kneeling in front of him. "Breathe with me." Mateo tried, but his chest wasn't expanding fully. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. His fingers twitched. Then his body stiffened. The seizure hit without warning. Matteo's small frame jerked violently. Rafael froze for half a second, not because he didn't know what to do, but because nothing in his world had ever felt this fragile. "Marco!" he barked toward the hallway. But when Marco appeared, Rafael was already lifting his son into his arms. "No ambulance," Rafael said. "Car." He didn't wait for security to move, didn't hand Matteo to anyone, didn't shout orders like a king defending territory. He carried his son himself, down the staircase, through the front doors, into the night air. Chicago's cold cut sharp against Matteo's overheated skin. The SUV door swung open. "Northwestern," Rafael said. "Now." The car sped through red lights. Sirens were unnecessary. Traffic parted when they saw the vehicle. In the back seat, Rafael held Matteo against his chest. His son's body trembled again. "Stay with me," Rafael said quietly. Not commanding, not threatening, just pleading. "Stay." The emergency entrance lights were blinding. Nurses rushed forward with a stretcher. "No," Rafael snapped instinctively. He adjusted his grip and laid Matteo down himself. 6 years old, a nurse said quickly. "What happened?" "Seizure, severe asthma, 3 minutes." They wheeled Matteo through the doors. Rafael followed until someone stepped in front of him. "You can't go back there," his jaw tightened. "I don't wait in hallways." "Tonight you do." The words were firm, professional, and familiar. He looked up. Elena. No black uniform, no club lighting. Just navy scrubs and a badge clipped to her chest. For half a second, recognition passed between them. Then she turned toward the stretcher. "How long was he convulsing?" she asked sharply. 3 minutes, Rafael repeated. "Any prior seizures?" "No." "Get respiratory on standby," she told another nurse, "and prep a nebulizer." She moved fast, precise, confident. Rafael stood frozen. This wasn't Velvet Room. This wasn't a booth elevated above the crowd. This was fluorescent lighting and antiseptic air, and a closed door he couldn't force open. He stepped forward. "I want the best pediatric specialist in this hospital." "You already have him," she said without slowing. "Now, step back." There was no challenge in her tone, only urgency. He did something he rarely did. He obeyed. The doors swung shut. And Rafael DeLuca, the man who decided which businesses survived on the west side, stood alone in a hospital corridor with nothing in his hands. No leverage, no money, no authority. Just fear. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Security lingered at the far end of the hallway, unsure whether to intervene or stay invisible. Rafael didn't notice them. He replayed the seizure in his mind, the stiffness, the way Matteo's fingers curled, the silence when the shaking stopped. He had faced down men with guns, negotiated with people who wanted him dead, but none of that prepared him for a closed hospital door. 42 minutes later, it opened. Elena stepped out first. Her expression was composed, but not casual. "He's stable," she said. The word hit harder than relief. Stable. "What happened?" Rafael asked. "Severe asthma exacerbation triggered a seizure. It can happen in children. We stopped it. He's on oxygen. We're monitoring." "Will it happen again?" "It might," she said honestly. "But we can manage it." Rafael exhaled slowly, not dramatically, just enough to prove he'd been holding his breath. She watched him for a moment. The ruthless composure was back on his face, but something underneath it had cracked. For the first time since she'd met him, he didn't look untouchable. He looked like a father who had almost lost the only thing he couldn't replace. And the night that began with ego had just become something far more dangerous. Matteo was asleep when Rafael entered the room. Small body beneath 2 white hospital sheets. Oxygen cannula resting beneath his nose. Heart monitor pulsing steady green lines across the screen. Rafael stepped closer slowly. The chaos had faded. The machines hummed. The world outside the hospital resumed moving. But inside this room, time felt thin. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn immediately. "I need a private pediatric specialist," Rafael said, voice steady again. Someone I trust. You already have the best pediatric team in Chicago, Elena replied. He turned then. She stood at the foot of the bed, chart in hand. No hesitation in her posture. No trace of the nightclub version of herself. Just composed competence. You're assigned to him? Rafael asked. Yes. And if I request someone else? You can request anything, she said calmly. The hospital will still assign whoever is most qualified. A small pause. And tonight, she added, that's me. There was no challenge in her tone, just fact. Rafael stepped closer. I don't take chances with my son. Neither do I, she replied. He held her gaze. You think I'm the problem. I think you're not used to not being in control. He didn't deny it. He glanced at the IV line. Is the dosage correct? Yes. Is he stable? Yes. How long until discharge? That depends on how he responds overnight. His jaw tightened slightly. I don't wait for uncertainty. She stepped closer to the bed, adjusted the oxygen line with careful fingers. You don't have a choice. That landed harder than anything she'd said at the club. Rafael wasn't used to inevitability. He was used to solutions. Money isn't the issue, he said. I know. You don't seem impressed by that. I'm impressed by outcomes, she replied. Not accounts. A beat of silence. The machine beeped steadily behind them. You tried to buy me, she said quietly. That's how I solve problems. And did it work? He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted direction. I can have a private floor cleared, he said. More security, better comfort. Elena stepped between him and the door. No. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just final. Your security can wait outside the hospital, she continued. Not inside this room. His eyes narrowed slightly. You're telling me what to do. In here, she said evenly. You're just a father. The words hung in the air, not insulting, not cruel, just true. Rafael felt the inversion fully then. At Velvet Room, she had been on his ground. Here, he was on hers. She moved with certainty. He stood with uncertainty. She approached the bed again and checked Mateo's pulse manually, fingers light at his wrist. His oxygen saturation is improving, she said. That's what matters. He watched her work, the steadiness of her hands, the absence of fear. You're not intimidated, he said. By what? By me. She didn't look up. Should I be? The question wasn't sarcastic. It was honest. Rafael studied her carefully. He had spent years building a reputation strong enough that men twice his size stepped aside without being told. But she didn't react to that reputation. She reacted to reality. You humiliated me, he said quietly. She straightened. You tried to reduce me. And now? Now I'm doing my job. A nurse knocked lightly and handed her a tablet. Elena scanned the data. He'll stay overnight, she said. We'll monitor his breathing patterns, adjust medication. If there are no complications, he can go home tomorrow. Rafael stepped toward the bed. For a second, the hardness returned to his posture. Then he brushed Mateo's hair back gently. It was such a subtle movement that Elena almost missed it. That wasn't a crime lord. That was a father afraid of losing something fragile. Rafael looked at her again. If something goes wrong, it won't, she said calmly. And if it does, we handle it. No fear. No flinch. Just resolve. For the first time since she'd met him, he wasn't the dominant force in the room. She was. And the most powerful man on Chicago's west side had no choice but to trust the woman who once refused his money. By 4:30 a.m., the hospital had quieted. The hallway lights dimmed. Footsteps softened. The city outside was still hours from waking. Inside room 312, Mateo's breathing had steadied into a slow, even rhythm. The oxygen cannula remained in place, but the panic had passed. Elena checked the monitor one last time before stepping back toward the doorway. She meant to leave him alone, but she paused. Rafael stood at the side of the bed, one hand resting lightly on the railing. His suit jacket lay folded over a chair. His sleeves were rolled unevenly now. He didn't look like the man who owned nightclubs and shipping routes. He looked exhausted. Mateo shifted slightly in his sleep. Rafael leaned down, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Take it from me," he murmured. "Take the money, the houses, the cars, or just leave him." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. They were simple. Desperate. Elena hadn't meant to hear it. She stepped back quietly before he noticed, but the image stayed with her. 20 minutes later, she found him in the hallway near the vending machines, alone. His security detail stood far enough away to give the illusion of privacy. He didn't look surprised to see her. "He's stable," she said. "I know. You can go home. We'll call if anything changes. I'm staying." It wasn't negotiable. She nodded once. A beat of silence passed between them. Then he spoke. "You heard me." It wasn't a question. "Yes." He looked at the floor for a moment. "That wasn't meant for an audience." "I wasn't your audience." He studied her carefully. "You see weakness? I saw a father." The correction landed quietly. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly, as if recalibrating. "You embarrassed me," he said. "You tried to buy me. You could have handled it differently. So could you." There was no hostility in her tone now, just clarity. "You think I treat everyone that way?" he asked. "I think you're used to being obeyed. And you're not impressed by that." "No." "Why?" She folded her arms loosely. "Because power without restraint is just insecurity with resources." The words hung between them. He could have snapped back. He didn't. "You talk like someone who's been underestimated," he said. "I have. And I decided I wouldn't let it shape me." Rafael leaned against the wall. "You assume my world is built on intimidation, isn't it? It's built on control. Same difference." A faint exhale left him, not quite a laugh. "You think you understand me," he said. "I think you don't understand yourself." That caught him. "You believe I can change. I believe you choose." She stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. "You chose not to humiliate me back at the club." "You misread that," he said. "I don't react when I'm being tested." "You reacted," she replied. "You just didn't explode." Another silence. He studied her differently now, not as a disruption, not as a problem, as a mirror. "You could ask me for anything right now," he said quietly. "Debt cleared, promotion, a better apartment. I don't want anything from you. That's rare. It's necessary." He looked almost curious. "You don't trust me." "I don't need to." He stepped closer, not threatening, just present. When most people would leverage this moment. "I'm not most people." "And what are you?" "A nurse," she said simply. "And someone who doesn't confuse gratitude with ownership." The monitor inside the room beeped softly. Mateo stirred but didn't wake. Rafael glanced toward the door, instinctively protective. When he looked back at her, the edge in his posture had softened, but not disappeared. "You're very certain," he said. "I'm very clear. And if my world collides with yours again?" "It will," she said calmly. The answer surprised him. "And when it does?" She met his eyes fully. "Don't try to buy me." There it was again. Not flirtation, not submission, just strength. For the first time that night, something shifted beneath his composure. Not surrender, recognition. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I was," she admitted quietly. "Sorry, at the club. I just decided I didn't want to live that way." That honesty settled differently than defiance. He considered her for a long moment. Then nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. "Go get some rest," she said. "You look worse than your son." A small pause. "That's the closest thing to an insult I've heard from you tonight." It wasn't an insult. Then what was it? Concern. The word lingered. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted. The night that began with ego had become something far more dangerous, mutual awareness, and neither of them knew yet what that meant. The hospital was too quiet. Rafael noticed it first. Not the normal quiet of early morning, but the kind that comes when people are watching. He stood outside Mateo's room, phone in hand, but not using it. Security had tightened their formation in the hallway, subtle but alert. Marco approached. "Two unfamiliar faces in the lobby," he said low. "Didn't check in, didn't ask questions, just watching." Rafael didn't turn his head. Descriptions. Southside crew, Aguilar's boys. That made sense. Aguilar had been circling territory for months, waiting, probing. Weakness invited teeth. "And they know?" Rafael asked. "They saw your car pull up." "Of course they did." Rafael handed his phone to Marco. "Handle it." Marco hesitated. "Here?" Rafael's jaw tightened. "Not in the room," he said quietly. The hallway doors opened at the far end. Two men entered, not armed visibly. Casual jackets, confident posture. They weren't here to shoot. They were here to send a message. One of them smirked slightly when he saw Rafael. "Didn't know you were taking meetings in hospitals now," he said casually. Security shifted. Rafael didn't. "What do you want?" he asked evenly. "Just checking on the kid," the other replied. "Heard he had a rough night." There it was. Confirmation. They knew. Rafael stepped forward slowly. The air tightened instantly. "You're in the wrong building," he said. "Relax," the first man said. "We're not animals." A lie. Rafael's eyes darkened. "Give Aguilar a message," he said calmly. "If he ever breathes my son's name again, I'll remove his." The man's smile thinned. "Threats in a hospital?" he asked. "Promise," Rafael corrected. One of his security men stepped closer. The tension rose fast, the kind that escalates without warning. And then, Elena stepped into the hallway. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't hesitate either. "This is a hospital," she said firmly. All eyes turned toward her. "Family of the patient?" she asked the two men. They didn't answer. "Then you don't belong here," the first man scoffed. "You want to escort us out?" "If necessary," she replied evenly. Rafael glanced at her briefly. Wrong move. She stepped closer to him instead. "Not here," she said quietly. He didn't respond. "Not in front of your son," she added. That landed. The rival men noticed the hesitation. "See?" one of them said. "Even the nurse knows this isn't your turf." Rafael's composure snapped back into place. "Marco," he said calmly. Marco nodded. The two security men moved forward. No shouting, no punches, just controlled pressure. The rival men backed toward the elevators. "This isn't over," one muttered. "It never is," Rafael replied. The elevator doors closed. Silence returned to the hallway. Security remained alert, but the threat had passed. Elena turned to him. "You were about to escalate that." "They walked into my son's hospital room." "They walked into a hospital," she corrected. "There's a difference. They won't do it again." "Because you scared them?" "Because I will." She held his gaze. "And what would that cost?" He didn't answer. She stepped closer. "If you turn this place into a battlefield, the only person who loses is him." Her eyes flicked toward Mateo's door. Rafael followed her glance. His son, sleeping, small, unaware of territory wars and reputations. Rafael exhaled slowly. "They came because they thought I was distracted," he said. "You are," she replied gently. "That's not weakness. In my world, it is." "Then maybe your world needs different rules." He studied her again. She had just interrupted a confrontation between rival crews, and she hadn't trembled. "You're very brave," he said. "No," she replied. "I just know what matters." A long silence stretched between them. Then Rafael nodded once, to Marco. "Stand down," he said. Marco blinked once, surprised, but obeyed. Security stepped back. No retaliation order, no counterstrike, just restraint. Rafael looked at Elena. "This doesn't change who I am," he said. "I didn't ask it to. And they will pay." She didn't argue that. "Just not here," she said. For a moment, the tension softened. He had chosen. Not mercy. Control. For his son. For the room. And she saw it. That choice. Not soft, not gentle, but deliberate. And far more powerful than violence. Perfect. Clean ending. No fairy tale. No kiss. Just recognition, restraint, and tension that lingers. Morning crept slowly over Chicago. The lake outside the hospital windows caught the first pale streaks of sunlight, turning steel-blue water into something softer. Inside room 312, Mateo slept peacefully. The oxygen line was gone. The monitors were quiet. Just the steady rhythm of a child who had survived the night. Rafael stood beside the bed, one hand resting lightly against the rail. He hadn't slept. He didn't need to. Mateo shifted, eyes fluttering open. "Papa." "I'm here," Rafael said immediately. The boy smiled faintly. "Did I scare you?" Rafael hesitated. "Yes," he answered honestly. Mateo grinned weakly. "Sorry." Rafael brushed a hand through his son's hair. "Don't apologize for breathing," he said softly. Elena entered a few minutes later with discharge papers. "Vitals look good," she said. "We'll adjust his medication. Tom, you'll need follow-ups. No skipping them." Rafael nodded once. "I won't." She stepped closer to Mateo. "You gave us a scare," she told him gently. Mateo looked at her seriously. "Papa says I'm strong." "You are," she said. "But even strong people ask for help." Mateo nodded, satisfied with that answer. After she finished explaining the treatment plan, she stepped back. Rafael watched her carefully. There was no arrogance in her posture, no triumph, just quiet competence. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a command. She hesitated for a second, then nodded. They stepped into the hallway. The hospital was awake now, nurses changing shifts, families arriving, coffee cups in hands. Rafael turned to her. "Thank you." It wasn't casual. It wasn't strategic. It was real. "You don't owe me gratitude," she replied. I did my job. You did more than that." She didn't respond. He reached into his jacket slowly. Not cash this time. A simple card. No logo. No title. Just his name and a number. "If you ever need something," he said. "Anything. You call." She looked at the card, then at him. "I won't." A small pause. "Because you don't need help?" he asked. "Because I don't want to owe you." He studied her face. "You wouldn't owe me. In your world, everything has a cost." He didn't argue. Instead, he slipped the card back into his pocket. "You're consistent," he said. "So are you." Another beat of silence passed. "You could make Chicago better," she said quietly. He almost smiled. "You think it's that simple?" "No," she replied. "I think it's that hard." He held her gaze. "And if I don't?" "Then nothing changes." It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a fact. Rafael glanced down the hallway toward Mateo's room, then back at her. "You're not afraid of what I am." "I'm aware of what you are," she corrected. "And?" "And I don't confuse power with character." The words didn't wound. They anchored. He extended his hand. Not dominance, not ownership, just acknowledgement. She looked at it, then shook it. His grip was firm, warm, controlled. The handshake lasted half a second longer than necessary. No smile, no softness, just recognition. He released her first. "I won't try to buy you again," he said. "That would be wise." A faint flicker crossed his expression. Respect. Security began to gather near the elevators. The world outside was waiting for him to return to it. Territory disputes, negotiations, quiet removals, power. He turned to leave, then paused. "Elena." She looked up. "You were right," he said quietly. "About control." Her expression shifted slightly. "And?" "I don't always have it." That was as close to vulnerability as Rafael DeLuca would ever publicly admit. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Elena stood there for a moment, not smiling, not dreaming, just thinking. Power hadn't changed hands. Chicago would still answer to Rafael DeLuca, but something inside him had shifted. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. Now let me ask you something. If you were Elena, Would you trust a man like Rafael to truly change? Or would you walk away before his world swallowed yours? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story of power, pride, and the one woman Chicago's coldest man couldn't buy, hit like, subscribe, and stay close. Because sometimes the most dangerous battles happen in silence.